everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Open Minds on Air, the official podcast of the Open Minds Foundation. I am your co-host, Pierce Redmond, and today's episode is actually a continuation of our last episode with Jon Atack and Christian Zurko. We began by discussing the recent conference, several conferences that Jon attended in both Lisbon and Rotterdam for the Radicalization Awareness Network. We spoke about the process of radicalization and much more.
Yeah, I've been to a meeting in Lisbon and another one in Rotterdam last month that were hosted by the Radicalization Awareness Network, which is funded by the 28 current member states of the European Union. In Rotterdam, there are also members of a group called Exit, which people from around Europe who are dealing with extremist groups, particularly violent extremist groups, so right-wing groups. They'd be happy to deal with left-wing violent groups too if they could find some. I'm sure they'll keep looking. But no, I shouldn't make light. They're dealing with neo-Nazis, with football hooligans, with the gangs in Catalonia, Barcelona. With de-radicalization, with all sorts of issues, people coming in from the probation services, the prison services, the counter-terrorism services, all sorts of places. I was very heartened at both meetings to find that so many intelligent and compassionate people are working in these areas, that their intention is to be helpful. To find out how to better integrate our societies so that we can cooperate more and collaborate more. So it was fascinating being thrust into that world. I've been reading about terrorism and indeed have interviewed one or two former terrorists along the way. But I've been reading about it, since before 9/11. It just seemed to me that there was this natural link, that the skills that some of us acquired doing exit counseling with so-called cult members, high demand group, authoritarian, totalitarian group, whatever term you want, but groups that take away people's authority from them, and replace it. That having spent time learning how to do that, this would probably apply more generally. That the approach that Christian has talked about, where you have to be on side with the person, you're not there to have an argument, you're not there to be in conflict, you're there to help the person, by bringing them information they don't have, showing them conflicts within ideas that they do have, bringing them to reconsider their involvement in a group. But it seemed to me, from the 1990s onwards, that it would be really good to get to try and work with people in this area. So for me, it was fantastic to, finally had a little. We do have. Robert Orell is actually on our board, advisory board, and he's a leading member of Radicalization Awareness Network and working with Exit. But we've not really worked together. We sort of met at the ICSA conference, International Cultic Studies Association conference in Bordeaux last year, and we've Skyped. But to actually get into that world and find that there are people at all levels and all around who really want to make the society better. Their sense is not to find some people and punish them, but to actually do something about this. And I think that, there were people from Prevent at this meeting who in the UK, they go out and teach people the perils of terrorism. I was, the meetings are very well run. The idea is to stimulate thinking. in the various participants. So by bringing together people from different fields and having a few of us give short talks, and then separating us up into 3 or 4 groups to hash out some idea, and then come back 15 minutes later and describe our thinking about it. I think and bringing people from the different worlds into the different groups, I think it's a very positive approach. And I came away really heartened that our approach, which is quite simply fundamentally to show people psychology, to hone their critical thinking skills, to get them to think about why they're certain about things, how that certainty was developed and how much it's based on real evidence and how much it's just, how they feel and how those feeling, to teach those basic things, I think is very important. And the intelligent disobedience and courageous followership, which we take from Ira Chaleff, the Heroic Imagination Project, which the great Philip Zimbardo initiated, with the understanding that everybody who lives it's heroic to be alive. It is heroic to be alive, no matter what your life is. It's a hero's journey, though not necessarily with the same steps that Joseph Campbell would put down. You won't necessarily meet an old person on the edge of a wood at the start of your life, to bring together this information and say, well, what with Open Minds, what we want to do is to make a free. What we have done is made a free website accessible to all, and we want to make it more accessible. We want to have cartoons. We now have a fantastic cartoonist who's got an astonishing track record, Vince DePorter. He can bring us a certain approach, which I think we all like cartoons, caricatures, animations. I think we like those kind of things. So we'd like to go. It's somehow easier to take information in. It's less challenging or less threat to watch South Park than to watch the BBC News or something. And the humour of these things also, I think, helps tremendously. So by translating these basic ideas in social psychology and personal clinical psychology, based upon evidence, which can, there may be reinterpretations of that evidence somewhere along the way. We shouldn't be rigid about that. But when you've got 400 studies that suggest something, it might be worth taking notice of it. And making that accessible to kids, to anyone, to everyone of whatever age, in as many languages as possible, and then creating a route through that so that teachers and parents and kids themselves can say, well, I can learn about this. I mean, I really love School of Life and Book of Life, those websites where you get a flirting. What is the meaning of flirting? Mm-hmm. And you get somebody going on for 5 minutes about that. I think that's so useful and so much something that's missing from our educational system. It's geography, history, math, physics, chemistry, biology, Spanish. The physical education. These are things you have to learn. This notion of these subjects when there is so much to understand about being alive. And my mum always used to say that the first thing they should teach you at school is how to be a parent. They should start at the beginning and be teaching you. And she meant, changing diapers and how to cook and how to garden and how to, wallpaper if you must wallpaper. An education in these things. But where is the whole piece of the education that's about how to communicate, how to analyze, what used to be called rhetoric, until it dropped out of the curriculum pretty much. And it used to be the center of the curriculum for about 2,000 years. This idea of how to analyze, break facts down and look at bits of evidence, evaluate, see what they mean, synthesize the parts of them, and then articulate, be able to talk about what you've learned, which is such a useful thing to be able to, talk about things. And because that's usually the point where I find that I don't know what I'm talking about, that I try to articulate something I've read in a book, and I'm quite happy, enthusiastic about. And I'll suddenly realize there's some part of it that I can't explain because I didn't understand it, So those skills, being able to articulate, it's gone. The critical thinking skills there's some teaching about them, but much of what I read about that is how to write an essay. They're trying to
how to take
teach
a test.
Yeah, how to take a test.
Well, it's funny you just mentioning that. I mean, the lack of that sort of stuff, and this is something we've talked about before, but it seems, bringing it back to the Radicalization Awareness Network and the conference and stuff. I mean, the lack of that sort of teaching, the sort of practical life skills, seems to, in some cases, allow for radicalization to happen at a younger and younger age. And we see that a lot with, particularly like far right groups in the West and extremist jihadi groups as well. I mean, targeting younger and younger people, being able to sort of gain influence with, people coming just out of high school, maybe just out of college. I mean, that's a wonderful recruitment time for anybody. But it seems, particularly, I'm thinking of like some of the far right groups in the West, or you mentioned before, like football hooligans. These are young men mostly that seem to be so kind of caught up in this, and in their desire to want to, I don't know, fit in or be part of something. I mean, they end up kind of succumbing and being manipulated once again.
Yeah, I mean, one of the guys who spoke was actually involved with quieting down the gang problem in Spain, in part of Spain, and they had the Latin Kings arriving from Ecuador and their rival gang, and so he explained how he'd pretty much dealt with this problem, which was a fascinating story. He went to Ecuador. He saw the terrible overcrowding in the prisons there, the brutal way in which gang members were treated, and that division. And he went to the US and saw what was happening there. Went home and set up a community police force and communicated with them and got them to talk with each other and explained that they could have this identity as these people, dress in this way, behave in this way, but they mustn't commit any crimes. And he made that happen. What a remarkable, man and a group of doubtless people around him. That those gangs are still there, and they're not. That's like a safe haven for the Latin Kings,
right?
That because it allows them to express their social identity, which is a very important aspect of who we are. My thought is that by our program can be tailored to, the fundamental of Open Minds is really this thought that the dynamics of human beings are the same. If you look at groups are quite different one from another, but they still fit into sort of types and categories. If you look at people, then you've got some pretty fundamental similarities that are going on. So one of them is that when you're in a group, you believe that it's the elite group. You believe that it's the way, the truth, and the life. It's the only way. I would say that a group that's like that, you have to be a little bit cautious of, personally. But it doesn't matter what the group says about itself. By belonging to it, one is, conferring a superior status upon it, and saying, we know better about the world. We creationists, we know more about what really happened in 4004 BC when the dinosaurs were all deposited in the geological fault lines.
Well, we're talking about radicalization. I was just mentioning far right groups, the sort of lack of understanding that goes on when you're a child, let's say. Again, based on school systems and things like that. Christian, in the work that you do, what's your sort of experience when you meet, say, I don't know if you have met any far right individuals, but what's your sort of take on when a radicalized person kind of walks into your office or calls you up on the phone? Is it different from other, let's say, cult groups? I mean, I'm thinking of gang members, maybe, of people that are maybe part of radical political groups. Is that any different? Is your approach kind of the same?
Well, first of all, it can be different depending on who approaches me. Some people approach me and they have a very neutral attitude. They don't know a lot about me. They're curious, but they don't really have a set opinion. Other people have already been warned either about people like me, that we are terrible people who are going to, we're faith breakers and faith warriors and all this other stuff, or else there are a couple of groups that have given me names in the past. I think that's kind of become obsolete now, but I know in the 80s and 90s.
You were a deadly demon, weren't you?
I was a deadly demon by one group. I was, and I had these various names signifying that I was not to be spoken to, and by name I was warned off of. But if people come to me expecting antagonism or expecting to have a fight with me, then obviously I need to let them get to know me and become comfortable with me before we can do anything else. They've got to decide, first of all, that it's worth A, not killing me, and B, talking to me. But once we get past that, essentially it's always the same thing. In certain circumstances, there's a sameness about it insofar as whatever the belief system is, I start from the assumption that whatever a person believes, assuming that they actually believe it and don't just hold it as a nice idea, it shapes the way they live. Example I use is, if I believed I could walk through solid objects, I'd never open a door again. I might break most of my face, but I would not open any more doors. At some point, I would have to overcome that and either really learn how to walk through solid objects or start opening doors.
Or call 911.
Or call 911 a lot, yes. What I'm saying here is that we tend to act on the things that we hold to be true. The way we perceive reality is the way we try to live in reality. To the extent that reality is the way we think it is, we succeed. To the extent that reality is different, we fail. If somebody really, really holds what you're calling extreme right-wing views, far-right views, they're going to live as if certain people are less worthy than others, certain people aren't really truly human, and so on. I do find that some people are better than the beliefs they claim to hold in certain ways, in surprising ways sometimes. I also find that sometimes people are worse than the beliefs they claim to hold. And that's why I go back to what I said before, that I'm interested not in the group as it is in itself, but in the group in the person's head. Like if there are 50,000 members of a group, then there are at least 50,000 different versions of that group. That's the way I look at it. And so I look to find what the person actually believes. I'm interested in getting them to tell me. It doesn't matter that they may be talking to me about a group that I actually know better than they do. It doesn't matter. What matters is, what is the group that's in their head? That's who I have to talk to.
It's funny when I'm thinking of these sorts of, say, far right groups or
far left groups,
or far left groups, certainly, far left groups or extremist religious groups or political movements. I mean, there seems to be, it's almost like this sense that they're sort of too far gone. That once they've entered into a neo-Nazi group or, let's say, a Maoist, militia, that's it. There's really, they're kind of lost souls, that they can't be counseled out. They can't be swayed into perhaps re-entering society the way that they were prior to that. And do you see, I'll open this up to the both of you. I mean, do you see this as like a serious problem? Because it seems like there is there's this sort of lack of caring amongst a lot of, it's like, oh, well, I'm never going to give this person a chance because look what they said in the past or look what they did in the past. It's sort of like, we'll just lock them all up. That's the only thing we can do.
I just want to pick up two things that you said there. The one is that I'm not altogether convinced that the expression that somebody can be counseled out of something is helpful here. And I know you didn't mean that in any kind of hardcore way, but I do withdraw from that kind of thing because I simply feel that counseling somebody out of or into anything is a shortcut to a dead end. I would much rather see the process as encouraging them to reevaluate, to reconsider evidence that maybe they weren't even aware existed, and to reevaluate where they're going to go next. That would be the first thing. The second thing is that whole thing about giving people a second chance. Some of the people who have been particularly effective in dealing with various kinds of extremism, some of the most effective people have been the former extremists.
Right.
When in the last session when we were talking about gangs, it occurred to me that back in 1992 or 3 in Los Angeles, where there was terrible feuding between the Bloods and the Crips. I mean, the color of your shoelaces could get you killed if you were in the wrong neighborhood.
Is that why you wear rainbow-coloured shoelaces?
Oh, I haven't had those for a long time. I can't get
just
the
to
ones
make
I
you
want.
safe in all zones.
I haven't been able to get the ones I want for a long time, actually.
But if anybody's listening and they can get rainbow shoelaces, do
Oh, yeah. Gosh, there's only one other person that I know that keeps bringing up rainbow shoelaces to me, but never mind, we won't go there.
Won't mention Eileen Barker at all.
We won't mention her, no. But, it was one of the gang members who managed to establish a series of events which led to a long-standing truce between those two gangs. I also think of
Tookie Williams. Tookie Williams, Stanley Tookie Williams, the founder of the Crips, one of the two founders, who is said to have helped 1,000 people reconsider their involvement with all sorts of different groups. Yeah. Incredible, man.
And likewise in Germany, one of the people who's been most effective in dealing with neo-Nazis is a former neo-Nazi. And I just feel that this attitude of you can't help that person, they're too far gone. I understand the sentiment. There was a time in my own life when I was considered too weird to help.
I still feel that about you.
Well, I mean, yes, there are still people who feel that way about me, but on the other hand,
to help. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I have managed to come around and be of some use to other people who are in that same situation. So I have my very strong reservations about this idea that somebody could be too far gone. I think if somebody is very extreme, you do have to look at all the angles of what's going on in their life to be sure that they really are getting the help they need to think their way through and work their way through to a genuine evaluation of the things that they have believed. But nevertheless, I don't believe in the idea that a person's too far gone. If I got a phone call, and I know some people think this is horrible, but if I got a phone call from David Miscavige tomorrow saying, I'd like to have confidential conversations with somebody who's not a part of Scientology, I would have no problem with that.
No, me neither.
Why not?
Me neither.
Why not?
In fact, why don't we send him our phone numbers and see if he'd like to call us?
I think he's already listening in, John.
DM, if you're listening, if you're out there, please contact
We'd love
us.
to meet over coffee. Yeah, we'd love to.
But seriously, I just don't have a lot of time for that kind of polarization into us and them, because that kind of polarization is actually what makes an extremist sect work. It's it's the kind of black and white thinking which sects depend on to grab and hold their membership.
I only mentioned it because it seems like we're in such a politically charged, biased environment right now, where there really is this belief, like, no, they are evil, whether it's the alt-right or Antifa or this group or that group or the other. It's and it's a scary mindset to be in, because you never know what group you're going to end up in, and suddenly then no one is going to come to your aid, and also just because it's I don't know, it's like, again, it's another way of dehumanizing people,
exactly,
and that again, it plays into the group, the radical group. I mean, they like you were saying, Christian, I mean, they want to maintain this facade that it's us versus them. But
yes.
And I think it also, it depersonalizes them and just sort of, it makes many people just not care. And I mean, I've used this example many times on my show and on this podcast as well. I mean, the way that we've sort of done that with a lot of cult groups that we don't like. I mean, we fetishize certain groups for some bizarre reason, but the Branch Davidians, well, they had it coming. Yes. They deserved what they got. They shot for whatever idiotic reason. And again, it's but these are still people.
Exactly. They're still people, and they could have been drawn out. I go back on that same pattern to the Jonestown thing.
Yeah.
There were incidents where parents and children, husbands and wives, they had gone into the group, and by the time the suicides, which were actually murders, took place, by the time the mass murders took place, you had instances where half of a family was in and the other half of the family was out. And the part of the family that was in saying, please, if you really leave, go far away so we don't know where you are because he'll send us to kill you. Now, there was a family named, I can't remember the husband's name. The woman's name was Deanna Myrtle. She and her husband left. They had been amongst the leaders in Jonestown. And when they told their daughters that they were going to be leaving, this is what their daughters said to them: please go far away so we don't have to kill you. Now, they were all in as extremely as you could get. And yet, some were able to find their way out again, and some weren't. And my feeling is perhaps if those murders hadn't taken place, more could have been drawn out and encouraged to find an alternative to living and dying in Jonestown. But we'll never know.
Certainly Jim Jones had come to the point where he wasn't going to let that happen.
Exactly.
And I'd like to point out that it was Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, by the way.
Of course it was Flavor Aid. I didn't mention any.
No, you didn't. No, Christian, you didn't. You're absolutely accurate. I'm just advising the public that the Kool-Aid Drinks Corporation got a pretty shabby deal out of that, because I was told just today that some group somewhere is being attacked by people leaving them Kool-Aid, saying, drink Kool-Aid. Well, it wasn't Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid. Let's be pedantically correct about that.
Absolutely. There's a place for pedantry, and this is it.
Yeah, this is always it, wherever we are at the moment.
It's a fascinating conversation we're having here with all this. I mean, again, the sort of in so many odd ways. I mean, that this mentality of us versus them, seems very kind of totalitarian and cult like for many individuals. Sort of looking out. I mean, again, it's we have to band together. These people are unclean. They're unworthy. And again, sort of proving the point that we're all so susceptible to influence and groupthink, and again, kind of forming up into our own sort of these little mini cults. So it's fascinating, but it does seem like we're reaching a point right now in society where this is sort of becoming heightened. And I mean, it is great that groups like Exit and the Radicalization Awareness Network are attempting to do this. And as you said earlier, John, that they're doing this, with compassion. Again, it's not this sort of like angry, you've got to leave this, scared straight sort of mentality. And especially with like gang members. I mean, it's just like, what do you really think you're going to get out of this? Nothing. Because in that sense, I mean, they are so far into the group, yelling at them is just going to reinforce it.
Oh, I was just reflecting on, in terms of gang members, you're also dealing with the problem of loss of faith within their community. You're dealing with the problem of the way that masculinity and even adulthood is tied in with being a good gang member. So it cuts right down. It's more obvious in a situation like a gang that it cuts right down to the sense of personal identity. We can often overlook that when we're dealing with a member of an extremist sect or something that seems less personal, that seems to be all about beliefs and therefore it's out there. But in fact, this cuts through all kinds of abusive manipulation and control. Wherever you see predatory influence, you are seeing aspects of the use of belief as a way to pierce into the person's sense of self and use their sense of self against them.
It's like a virus, but that's not necessarily the best of analogies, but it sort of goes into the cell and uses your DNA to replicate itself. So the kind of authoritarian,
yes, I see what you mean, yeah.
The authoritarian identity, the cult identity, as some would say, which is one of many strands of identity in a normal human being. You know, that we have our relationships with different people are different. The relationship to your mum, to your dog, to your boss, to an employee, to a cab driver. Those are different relationships. And they have different language that comes with them. The words that we use in those encounters, they have different behaviors, how formal or informal we are. And then you have the mood you're in while you're in that, which is a kind of XY axis, that there's who you're dealing with and what mood you're in. The cult then gives you, or the high demand group, whatever, gives you a pseudo identity, a pseudo self, as Eric Fromm called it, that sort of grafts itself in to everything you are and becomes the dominant thread. It doesn't mean, I'm not talking about any kind of multiple personality or anything like that. There's a spectrum of identity in anybody, and that becomes dominant. And it's how it's often the case, however, that there's always been something on the outside dominant. If people in their teens, I was 19 when I got involved with Scientology, but I think I'd lived quite a life already by then. So, you know, I'd been out of school for a couple of years and traveling around. So I'd seen some of the world. But if you're coming straight out of school, straight out of college, with little experience of the world, your identity is still being shaped. Yeah, and the involvement with the group, whatever group you're involved with, will shape that identity. You know, if you grow up somewhere where with a particular racial bias, it's most likely you'll have it, you know, because that's the environment you grew up in. It's not what you've thought about as being right. It's what feels right because you've always lived with it. If you don't live in a country where they eat frogs' legs or snails, you might think it's odd to eat frogs' legs or snails. If you're, you know, in a particular part of Australia, you might eat live witchetty grubs. And apparently they're delicious, I'm told, but I'm not going to try it. Certain parts of the world, people eat dogs. You know, there are cultures that you just look at it and go, that can't be right. You know, my poor little terrier, they couldn't do that. But wherever you go, that human beings have adapted and created a culture, and realizing, you know, my mum used to say that people in Nottingham, where she came from, didn't have an accent. They spoke proper English. And she, 25 years later, she moved back to Nottingham, and one of the first things she said was, wow, they do have an accent here. They say later. Instead of later. But that whole thing that the other culture is the out group, as a sociologist might say, it's, you know, we want to be comfortable, we want to belong, we want to be in a group.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was pointed out to me at this meeting in Lisbon is that if you run off with Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, whatever, the Republican Guard, as they used to be called, then there are certain advantages to that. If you're coming from a discipline, for example, where the bridegroom has to pay the equivalent of a dowry into a bride price, if it's normal within that culture, they'll let you off that. If you join ISIS, you can give just 5 candies and say, right, now you've had the. And there are a lot of rules that are actually, it sounds counterintuitive, that are relaxed. This is thought of as a fanatical religious group. I don't think of it that way. Al Qaeda, yeah, I think of it that way. The Taliban, yeah, they're religious scholars. That's what the word Taliban means. So yes, Daesh is something else altogether, I think. But it has this pretense of religion, which then says, "Oh no, you won't have to do these difficult things. You can have an easier life with us." Which then you get all the guilt and the phobia, and of course the aversion, the disgust that you are to feel towards the scum that is the rest of humanity, that you're to trample into the ground for the sake of righteousness and peace.
Yes, and see, I would take that even further in talking in terms of your question, that in talking about whether you're talking about gangs or you're talking about extremist politics, and I do mean extremist, where there's an in-group and an out-group in the sense of an Übermensch and the underlings. It's not simply that they offer you an in-group and an out-group. They're going right down to how you know what you are. So if you take a gang, when you are initiated into your gang, whether it's by killing or stealing or beating, whatever it is, you are identifying yourself as a man. You're not simply identifying yourself as a member. You're identifying yourself as a man. And that means that your manhood and all that entails is attached to not violating what is expected of you from the gang. So if I talk to a gang member, I've got certain things I must not do. I had a job at one point in the social services in an area just outside of Newark, which was quite a rough area. Our parking lot was the meeting point for two rival gangs to fight. In my time there, which was a little over a year, we had one of the gang members nearly lost his arm to a machete. We had any number of things like that happen, but we also had a shelter for battered women in our upstairs section. And I'm sorry, but it's the way it is. Men of a certain age are irresistibly fascinated by the availability of single women. And they were forever trying to get in to see certain of these women in our upstairs shelter. And at one point, I stopped 5 of them coming up the stairs to break into the upstairs facility. As they were coming up, I was at the top of the stairs, and I stood right in the middle of the staircase. And that was fine. As I talked to them, 4 of them carried on, turned around, went down the stairs, and that was fine. The 5th one stood there, and he was determined he was going to get by me no matter what. And then I made the mistake. I put my hand out in front of him, and I accidentally touched him. I didn't hit him. I didn't strike him. I didn't use any kind of force. I simply touched him. And that is just not a thing to be done. And at that moment, I had a choice. I could either bleed out on the staircase, because I'm sure that was what was coming next. I could either bleed out on the staircase, or I could say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to touch you, but I have to insist that you not come up the stairs. And fortunately for both of us, because it wouldn't have gone well.
He would have got blood on his clothes, obviously.
He would have gotten blood on his clothes, yes, and they were very nice clothes as well, because he was dressed for a date. So he would have lost out. I would have lost out because I would have been 6 pints lighter or whatever. Fortunately, he said, right, okay. And he turned around and he went down. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, he said, don't ever do that again. And he was absolutely right. In his context, the only thing, I think the good thing, was that no one else had seen me touch him. They'd already had their backs turned. They were going down the stairs. Yeah. I don't want to know what would have happened if he'd had to defend his honor. As it was an insult, but it wasn't a point of honor that he had to defend. There's so much of who I am as a gang member tied up in that membership. And it's so much more obvious there than if you say, well, I'm a faithful member of Osho's following, and I don't smell bad, and I sit there with a blissful look on my face. It's the same thing that's going on. I'm a good disciple, I'm a bad disciple, but it's not as obvious. In a gang, it is dead obvious likewise in an extremist right-wing or left-wing sect, whether it's, whoever it is. If you're willing to kill the underlings, you're a good member. If you flinch at the thought that you're going to bomb a bank, you're not such a good member. If you flinch at putting on a suicide vest, you're not really wholly devoted. It's not just about your beliefs. It's about who you are in your heart. And that's the thing we always have to have in our minds.
Yeah,
and that's the key to talking a person into reconsidering.
Yeah, and the worst people can become the best people.
Absolutely.
I'm very concerned about human predators and the notion that there are criminal psychopaths out there who have a deficit in the paralimbic system of the brain. If Kent Keel's work is right, and his work is substantial, he's examined hundreds of people, that if he's right, there's a deficiency there, and there are probably some people that there's almost nothing you can do for, that they, if they're committed to a form of violence, then they're probably going to do it. People who score sort of over 30 on the revised psychopathy checklist, between 30 and 40 on that scale, it might well be. But I've sat with people of all sorts of persuasions and disorders, all sorts of beliefs, and some of them extraordinarily extreme to me. And I've been there as they change their minds. So I know that it doesn't have to be that way. How many people can you reach? And Piers, we talked offline the other week, and we were talking about Holocaust denial.
Yeah.
And you said, well, there's really not much point in trying to dissuade somebody of this, because I think with all of us, our experience is that once people have dug themselves into a conspiracy theory, we all tend to defend what we believe. That's confirmation bias. And it's very difficult to go beyond that. It's very difficult to say, well, I could be wrong.
Oh, yeah. I know. I freely admit, I think with conspiracy theories, there's almost, it's like another sort of level psychologically, where
but cult groups believe conspiracy theories, if you like. So it's like, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the world's going to end in this year, and with the Battle of Armageddon, and that almost all groups have to have a kind of it's not a theology because it's not about God, but they have a set of beliefs that put them in. With Scientology, I believed von Daniken. The aliens came and they did all of this stuff. I was a Scientologist. That was a perfectly normal thing to believe. But the point is, so any conspiracy theorist, there's one end of it, which is the paranoid spectrum, where you are actually dealing with somebody who's paranoid. That's the reality of it. And there may be ways of helping them to not be so paranoid, with the use of medicines and counseling, psychotherapy, what have you, information. There may be ways of helping, but they're paranoid and they will see the world in that way. At the other end, I keep quoting that, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And I think, some people are born in a particular way, some people achieve it, and others have it, through abuse thrust upon them. And that we're capable of mimicking any behavior. So you can get people who mimic paranoia, who don't actually have any brain deficit that would cause paranoia. They've come to learn to be paranoid. You have people who are hyper vigilant. If you've grown up in an abusive environment, in any kind of abusive relationship, you will tend to be hyper vigilant. You will tend not to trust people, and you will tend to be watching people very carefully, and you might have heightened perceptions. Very heightened hearing I've come across in some people. You're watching out for something to happen. Your expectation will then condition your experience, and your life will fit in with what you believe is happening, if you follow me. So that even when you're with the nicest, sweetest, kindest people, you'll believe that they're plotting against you. Not because you're paranoid, but because your training in life, in childhood, has shown you that that's what's going to happen.
No, certainly, and I guess just to we were talking about the Holocaust denial and stuff. I mean, I was saying that too, just in the sense of, and this is not specific to them necessarily, but to a lot of groups like that. The goalposts are also constantly moving. Yeah. And they employ this bizarre doublethink within their own, again, Hitler was good, and he didn't really kill all the, he was actually trying to help some of the Jews.
He didn't really mean it.
Yeah, he didn't really mean it. There were bad Nazis around him that influenced him. Again, like we see with certain politicians. No, he's not really evil. It's the people around him. Yet at the same time, they despise all of the people that the Nazis targeted. So they're kind of proud of that. But at the same time, no, it wasn't really that. It wasn't 6 million. Maybe it was a million or 2.5. But that's it. Yet at the same time, I mean, they are impressed. They still believe that ultimately what the Nazis were doing was good and justified. So they kind of have it both ways. And I mean, I want to, put out hope that there are people in that particular mindset that can be swayed or can be given the space to question some of this themselves, or given the opportunity to look at another aspect of this, or because I think many of them also have, like all cult members, there are doubts that they possess. There's always those red flags in the back of your head. Well, this doesn't really quite add up, but I'm just going to push it away. But again, when you're in that sphere on the internet, you're never really going to see those questions posed to you.
Again, it was interesting that at the RAN-Exit meeting that I went to in Holland, there are a couple of guys who actually go online and engage with people. So they will create an identity, an anonymous online identity, and then they'll wander into some chat room, and they'll have a conversation with somebody. They'll find out who the dominant person in the chat room is, and they'll have a conversation with them. And they were reporting some success with this very direct approach. And you think, well, yeah, at least it's, those chat rooms get slowed down a little bit, don't they? Because somebody's demanding. And they, of course, they're not going in there and shouting at anybody or here's the evidence and this is what it says. You're first of all creating a relationship, and then you go Socrates on them. You ask questions.
Yes. And
those questions, I mean, the questions that Christian in the other episode we did brought up very close to my thing, which is you say to somebody, what did you expect from the group? What have you got from the group? What do you think others have got? And what do you think you're going to get? And you can almost leave the room sometimes because they've never thought about it. When I came to write down the cosmology and beliefs of Scientology, I realized that there's nowhere that they're written down. I had to consult about 20 different sources to say, oh, well, this is what Hubbard said, so this is the belief. But there is no short form. You've just got this mass of culture that you're immersed in, which for years later will still be in there, still be stuck in them.
He didn't write those things to answer the question, what do Scientologists believe? He answered those questions to give us a particular impression to a particular audience, didn't he?
Yeah,
so
and
he writes this answer for this audience and that answer for that audience.
It also depended what he'd been drinking, whether he'd take amphetamines, opiates, or barbiturates, or all three that day. These coloured his view. So, for example, and this is completely off the point, that it's a vital point as to whether the origin of the soul, the spirit, the thetan in Scientology, whether there is such an origin, whether we are all indeed completely individual. And that question is answered in Routine 247 of the 1954 book, Creation of Human Ability. It's nowhere else in the millions of words of Scientology, though it seems a vital point to the understanding of Scientology. I've not found it anywhere else. But yeah, that's a separate point. There's this whole immersion in culture where you just, it doesn't make any sense. And fundamentally, there's a difference between arguing a point and discussing a point. If you're dealing with a hardened true believer, you'll say something that they know is true, and they won't even blink.
Yep.
There'll be no acceptance of anything that denies their argument. If you're in a discussion and you want to learn something possibly along the way, then what happens is that if somebody says something's true and it's good evidence, you say, I'll have to look into that, or that's really interesting, or that's when you know that you're actually having a communication with somebody, as opposed to the kind of ping pong of whatever you say, I'm against it, in the words of Groucho Marx, which is all you'll get from somebody who's decided on all of these conspiracies, where you bring them a point that says, well, look, that the evidence of mercury in vaccines for autism, here's the evidence, here's why the doctor who proposed it was struck off by the General Medical Council, which has nothing to do with that claim. There's a raft of things he did. Here are the studies that demonstrate this isn't true. And you realize that the person's no longer listening to you. They're going, but, and the same with all of it. This, the most elaborate. I don't. Let's not even talk about this. I could be here all night.
Well, I was going to say we should do a whole. We could probably do a whole series. We should do definitely an episode on conspiracy theory, because that's something close to my heart.
Only one?
Yeah. Well, we can pick a few.
Listeners can vote. Which conspiracy would you like to pillory today?
But I think we might have to wrap it up here.
Cool.
Only because my girlfriend is en route and she is already texting me to tell me, she's 10 minutes away, 5 minutes away. So we might have to leave it here, but another wonderful episode with both of you. So again, I want to thank my co-host and friend, John Atack, for joining us. I also want to thank a board member of the Open Minds Foundation, Christian Zerko, for joining us. You can find Christian's website is dialoguecenter.co.org.
.org.
Yes.
.org, not .co.
Oh, no. It's it's .org.uk, right?
That's right.
Okay. So that is dialoguecenter.org.uk. We will link up to that in the show notes, so you can go and visit that. If you want to learn more about all of the work that we do here at the Open Minds Foundation, you can always go to openmindsfoundation.org if you want to hear more of my work. And lots of interviews on these topics and lots more. Certainly some on some conspiracy theories. You can go to PorkinsPolicyReview.com. Well, Christian and John, thank you so much for joining us again. We will definitely be talking very soon on these topics and more. So, Christian and John, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pierce. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Once again, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Open Minds on Air. If you would like to listen to previous episodes or learn more, then you can go to openmindsfoundation.org. And if you want to support the podcast, then please follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll be talking to you very soon.